Is there anything more American than fortune cookies? Americans love the to go Chinese restaurants, picking off these iconic menus, having tasty, filling, and affordable food, and, at the end of the meal, breaking into the fortune cookie that holds a message just for them. These cookies are served as an after meal treat at American Chinese restaurants, so obviously, fortune cookies have to be American or Chinese, right? To learn the origin of fortune cookies, we have to go back and see how American Chinese restaurants came to be. Tens of thousands of Chinese immigrants arrived in America as the word of the gold rush spread, and soon America saw its first Chinatown in San Francisco. With time, American Chinese restaurants started to appear, but the food they served was for the Chinese population, since Chinese food wasn't popular in America yet.
Because the Chinese can't work jobs that compete with American laborers, right? Especially the unions were not pleased with the idea of having a group of people who work for like sort of bottom, sort of like the lowest wages possible. Chinese immigrants had to sort of shift into different industries, right? And so the industries that they were allowed to be in were things like anything that was considered mercantile. And so if you worked in a restaurant or you owned a restaurant, that was considered okay, you could stay. Or if you owned a laundromat. So there was these sort of merchant sort of exceptions. And I think that's how the Chinese restaurant really sort of takes off.
As Chinese food slowly started to spread in California, the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act was put in place because Americans felt like their jobs were being stolen by the low-wage earning immigrants. Soon, anti-Chinese rhetoric poisoned the country, and the Chinese American workforce was redistributed from mining to farming, laundromats, and restaurants. Things slowly started to change at the turn of the century, and Americans started to enjoy dishes like chop suey and chow mein. However, fortune cookies were still very much absent from the American Chinese restaurants. But that was going to change when Japanese immigrated around mid-late 19th century, and by 1910 they had a population of nearly 72,000. And along with the Japanese culture, the recipe of the fortune cookie also immigrated to America.
Exclusion Act basically made it possible for Japanese to take the place of Chinese migrants to the United States. And so that started happening in the late 19th century, early 20th century. There were a lot of Japanese immigrants to the United States. One of the things that they brought was a sort of traditional cookie that is made, in Japan.
Historian Yasuka Nakamachi's research found that the cookie actually dates back to the Edo period of Japan. The Japanese name for the cookie was Sujiura Senbei, and it was bigger and darker. And the fortune slip went between the cookies. The fortune slips came from the Japanese tradition of fortunes written on strips and scrolls in temples. These fortunes are called Sujiura, and the rice cracker cookie is known as Senbei. Sujiura Senbei were a complimentary snack at cafes and restaurants in Japan, and the purpose of the fortune was to get conversations going. The man who brought Sujiura Senbei to America was a Japanese immigrant and the caretaker of the Japanese tea garden, Makoto Hagiwara. These cookies were handmade in the garden and were called tea cakes. When the demand for tea cakes rose, Hagiwara asked a confectionery shop owner, Suichi Okamura, to make the cookies for him. Okamura was the one who suggested Hagiwara to adapt the fortune cookie flavor that appealed more to the American crowd, which is when they readjusted the recipe. The traditional Japanese cookie was made with flour, sugar, sesame seed oil, and miso. But when Hagiwara and Okamura adopted the American flavors, they replaced sesame seed oil with vanilla and miso with butter. But if the Japanese invented the fortune cookies, how did it get to the American Chinese restaurants? During the early 20th century, American Chinese food was starting to get noticed by the American culture because it was affordable and filling. Even the famous painter Edward Hopper painted chop suey in 1929. At that point in time, raw fish wasn't popular in America, so it is expected that Japanese people were opening Chinese restaurants. And eventually, tea cakes were starting to be served with the check at these American Chinese restaurants. The Japanese-American produced tea cakes and American Chinese restaurants only rose in popularity until World War II.
During World War II, of course, Japanese Americans were interned by the United States government in most places except for Hawaii. And when they were interned, their businesses were sort of left, sort of like, well, I guess open to competitors taking, that space. And that's that void was taken by Chinese Americans. And so they started, producing fortune cookies. And over time that gradually gets sort of worked into Chinese cuisine. If you think of Chinese restaurants, often like there's a Chinese type bakery in the vicinity of other sort of Chinese food establishments, and so you can sort of see deals being made in let's say in Chinatown, where the Chinese American baker of fortune cookies is sending off his stuff to the restaurant down the street.
In 1942, FDR started sending Japanese Americans to internment camps, and just a year later, the Chinese Exclusion Act was repealed because America and China had become allies. By mid-late 50s, nearly half of American homes had television sets, and on those television sets, they watched Nixon eating Chinese food, which helped popularize the cuisine in America, and with it, fortune cookies. Today, there are more American Chinese restaurants in America than some of the most popular fast foods combined, making the cuisine more popular than ever. While the menus may vary, all American Chinese restaurants have one thing in common: they all serve fortune cookies. Some of the most American things we can think of were most likely brought by immigrants. Sports bars are a staple of American culture, and the first American sports bar was introduced by a family of Sicilian immigrants in St. Louis. America is made of and by immigrants. The way South Asians brought their spices, Chinese brought restaurants, just like that, amongst many other things, the Japanese brought fortune cookies, which the Chinese adopted, and America's melting pot gave them a home. Making fortune cookies an American experience.